All right, folks, welcome back to the Property Couch podcast. And today we've got a listener question about the rise of the financial influencer, or better known as the Finfluencer. We talk about what they are, who's most likely to seek advice from Finfluencers, and we also talk about red flags. What else do we cover, Ben?
Yeah, Bryce, and in what's making property news, I've got some latest data when it comes to people, population movement, and also the latest forecasts coming out from one of the property economists out there. So hang around to the end of the show where I reveal all when it comes to the next 3 years of property prices.
Revealing all, folks. That's a ripper. Let's rip into the show.
Welcome to the Property Couch, where each week you get to listen to two of Australia's leading experts. Bryce Holdaway, co-host of Location Australia on Foxtel's Lifestyle Channel, co-host of Escape from the City on the ABC, and partner of Empower Wealth Advisory. Ben Kingsley, chair of Property Investors Council of Australia and the founder of Empower Wealth Advisory, named the 2018 and 2019 Property Advisory Firm of the Year. Stay tuned as they bring you the insider's guide to property, finance, and money management.
All right, folks, welcome back to the Property Couch podcast, and welcome back to you too, Ben. How are you?
Mate, it is a terrific topic that we have to discuss today, so I'm super excited about today's show. But hey, you got a little bit of bark off on your nose. I mean, there's two things I want to talk to you about. Did you get in a fight with a Carlton supporter or something? Is that
Mate, I jumped the fence in Adelaide and I went and remonstrated with Jordan Clark and the umpire, and I got clocked. But
did you get the free kick against you, which cost you?
Yeah, it went back to the centre. I think it was a Collingwood umpire, to be honest. I think he had Collingwood undies on.
No. Collingwood umpires would never give a free kick to Carlton.
Yeah.
So yeah.
True that. Fair call. No, it makes for interesting audio when no one can actually see. But yes, I do have a big bit of bark off my nose. Long story short, Ben, I'm on a boat on Sunday, dolphin swim, kids, family.
Beautiful. Sounds amazing.
It's amazing, right? I'm in the water, holding onto the rope at the back. All these dolphins are swimming underneath me. Amazing. The day couldn't go better. Then I get back onto the boat, and the instructor has one of these long yellow flotation devices. And so she puts it around her waist to clip on, and it slips. And so it comes back at a rate of knots, flicks around. But the problem with that is, Ben, you think, oh, yes, soft little padding shouldn't be an issue. No, it's the dirty, great, big, fat, not just a standard carabiner, but a big, fat carabiner at the end. And it's like I just got punched. So blood is spewing everywhere. So the end.
So, did we thought about throwing you out the back of the boat? Other than swim with the dolphins, you could then swim with the sharks, or did they think about it?
I became the burley. But for those listening and can't see this on YouTube, they're thinking, guys, can you just move on? So yeah, little bit of an injury, but nothing too serious. But I was hoping we would go 0-4 for you, but we can't do that. And now then you have another win. So
yes, yeah. We're mind you, we make it hard for ourselves, right? You don't get out to a 38-point lead and then only fall over the line, right, with the ball just outside the 50 when the siren goes. So no, we've got a little bit of work to do. We're certainly not in that dominating, invincible form that we showed this time last year.
Let's be honest, you don't want to peak in April, do you? But
no,
you want to get on with it. Hey, we got a TPC survey, so we're going to ask our community, Ben, if they will contribute to what makes this podcast sizzle through 2024. So the STIG has set up a survey, thepropertycouch.com.au/tell us. Ben, just as it sounds, tell us, one word, lowercase, /tell us. And for everyone who contributes to that, we're going to give here we go, Ben, a free case study course. So it's the latest one. So we've got the book, The Armchair Guide to Property Investing. Chapter at the back of the book has 6 case studies. Well, the course that we've created here has 7 case studies because it's also got the forgotten case study, Ben. And all you have to do is contribute and you get that. So it's worth a couple of $100 to you for doing that. And then
wow, that's good.
And then the most insightful feedback will go into the draw to win $100 as well. So we'll be sending you an email if you're on our email distribution list. If you're not, there's a link in the show description. But we just want to hear from you. Won't take you long. I reckon it'll take you about 4.5 minutes to answer the survey, Ben. And it's just basically tell us the topics that you want to hear the most so that we can go out and hunt the best guests. We can curate the best topics. and hopefully give our audience and our community exactly what they need on their mission, Ben, on our mission to help them get $2,000 per week. So, Ben, we want them to contribute, don't we?
Yeah, look, obviously it's, we've done this survey, I think all the way back in 2019 or maybe it was 2020. So we're just trying to get an update in terms of what our community wants to hear from us and making sure that we're providing the best content in a timely fashion to them and so they can continue to get educated. So from that point of view, yeah, please contribute. If you're thinking, whatever it is you want to listen to or you're desperate about, but you don't want to, tell your story personally, this is the way in which you can add feedback to us and influence basically where the show goes. At the end of the day, it's a group community. It's your show. We want to make sure it's topical on everything that we talk about.
Yeah, it is the people show, Ben. It started out as the people show. It'll become more prevalent in the conversation we have today as to why we started and how we see ourselves in the landscape. But we definitely want to be giving the information to people to be better with their money so they can trap it and spend less than they earn. We want them to use that trapped surplus in our hope that they put a little bit away for tomorrow whilst doing some experiences for today. And then at some point in the future, they can retire on $2,000 a week. That's the goal. So let us know. Be the person who shapes what the future of this podcast looks like, and we'd love to hear from you. My Mindset Minute theme today, Ben, is very much linked into the conversation that we are going to have today, which starts as a listener question, which I'll read out to you shortly. And then you and I build out a framework for that particular listener question. But today, my Mindset Minute is really setting us up for the conversation that we're going to have. So first of all, here's the quote. The dead outnumber the living 14 to 1. So 6 billion on the planet, Ben, times that by 14. That's the number they're working with. And we ignore the accumulated experience of such a huge majority of mankind at our peril. That was Neil Ferguson on the Lessons of History. And this was from Voltaire. History never repeats itself. Man always does. And it's that last one that we really want to lean into today because the topic that we want to talk about today, Ben, is the rise of the financial influencers, aka Finfluencers. And there's an element of history never repeats itself, man always does, in what we're going to talk about today, which is really, really important. So I'm just going to set that up. I'm just going to leave that hanging in the air, Ben, but it'll make more sense as we go through the episode today. But as I said, the rise of the financial influencers, aka Finfluencers. And here's how it came about. Jen McFarlane sent me a little message on Instagram, Ben, which I've been asking people to do over the last couple of weeks. If you want to leave a speak pipe, you can. But if you want to talk to me directly, just go to Instagram and DM me. And Jen did that. And hers was about the rise of the financial influencers. And here's her question. Hi, Bryce. I'm a client of the advisory. Can you do a podcast on the rise of the financial influencers and what to look out for? There is a rise in the proliferation of these kinds of people on, here we go, Ben, there's one for you, social envy platforms.
Yes.
Moving from product and luxury good influencers to personal wealth management influencers. The barrier to entry on providing financial advice on socials is extremely low and unregulated. From what I can see, there are accredited conservatives like you. Thank you for that, Jen. There are up-and-coming agitators like, I'm not going to mention the name that she puts. And then there are the shock jock aggressives like, and again, we won't need to mention them. So with the last two kinds, carrying enticing value proposition for the impatient investor when consuming 15-second clips. Ben, that's a great statement, isn't it?
Yeah.
Enticing value proposition for the impatient investor. So we're clearly in the age of finance influencers, and what I would love to hear you guys talk about it. I believe in get rich slowly, as you say. However, the saturation of information promoting impatience is strong. It's probably a key challenge for Gen Z and millennials like myself over the next period. Ben, there's a few little hints in there, but good question, I reckon, from Jen, Ben, because interesting topic which has been tackled on a number of ways through a number of different platforms, but I reckon it's time for us to have a little swing on this topic too. What do you reckon?
It's a really good point, Bryce. I mean, coming back to your Mindset Minute theme, what we're talking about, history never repeats itself, man always does. So I suppose it's nothing new in the sense that you will hear someone preaching get rich quick and everyone is fearful of missing out. So they're playing to our insecurities in terms of if I don't follow this person's advice, or if I don't, if my shop front isn't as nice as their shop front when it comes to the social envy platforms that we're talking about. So the only difference is that there's a lot more of them now, right? If we go back in history, the printing press changed a lot because obviously you're able to get mass information out through the printing press. Then obviously you had radio and then television, and that was the great place to get to those eyeballs and the ears. And now what we're seeing is a proliferation through social media, where we've seen basically this whole idea of really wider means by which anyone can get onto social media and build a community and become an influencer. In this particular case, what we are seeing, and I think Jen sums it up beautifully when she talks about low barrier of entry in terms of being able to get into the market and just basically talk about finances. And the problem with that is, as we're about to unpack today, is that they can potentially get themselves into a little bit of areas where, they're in breach of the law and the regulations around the law. So that's what I think it's a really important topic to talk about today.
Well said, Ben. I'm glad you picked up on that point. History doesn't repeat itself. Man does. Human does, that is. So I guess the important part here is forever and a day there has been someone who has used some form of platform to try and preach a message around why they should be trusted around money. In the past, it was in platforms, it was in newsletters, it was in a whole range of things. Now it's social media. In 50 years' time, the same behavior by humans will exist. They will just use whatever the platform is at the time in 50 years. So, folks, that's the important point. Hey, listen, we've got a lot to say on this, folks, and we've got a lot to get through. So Ben and I, before we started recording, we looked at each other and we said, let's challenge ourselves here to make sure that we get through this in a way that doesn't have us going off on a million tangents. Now, we've never been able to pull that off yet in 489 episodes. So let's see how we go.
We'll try and keep it interesting.
So let's define it. What for those people who have never heard of the term Finfluencer, Ben? It is essentially short for financial influencer. So on social media, you've got an influencer, Kim Kardashian, The Rock, Conor McGregor. Let's just think about a few folks who are well and truly Taylor Swift. They're influencers because what they say and do on these platforms carries a lot of weight with the people that follow them, right? But a financial influencer is an individual who leverages digital platforms such as social media and blogs and podcasts and YouTube channels to provide financial advice and or education and or insights to their audience. So these influencers often have a significant following and influence over the audience's financial decisions and behaviors. And they may share personal finance tips, investment strategies, budgeting advice, or insights into economic trends, Ben. So these are well and truly people who have curated a micro audience, in some cases on the really large ones, a macro audience that tend to influence the decisions they make. So that's kind of the starting point here.
Yeah, and I think I like to summarize these because there's a lot of genuinely good-hearted people who are thinking that they might be doing the right thing in terms of wanting to educate and do that type of work. So there are a lot of really good Finfluencers who are doing that. But like everything, there's also a group of them that are a lot more aggressive in their actions and behaviors, and that then you start to then have got to decide about the decisions that you are making about, is it in my best interest that they're educating me? Because ultimately I'm the product, Bryce. You've always talked about that in any free platform that you're on, you're ultimately the product. So effectively, what is their end game? Is their end game to truly benefit you, or is their end game to ultimately create significant wealth for themselves?
Some are in it for you. Some are in it to create significant wealth for themselves. And that is the art and the science of trying to work out which Finfluencers you want to follow, right? So how do Finfluencers differ from the traditional financial advisor, Ben? We've sort of thought about it in 6 different ways. So first of all, I'll kick it off with accessibility. So financial influencers make their information accessible to the general public via free content on these social media platforms, right? So They pick up a mobile phone. They do it on a Zoom call or any. It's been, I guess, post COVID, it is more simple than ever to create some form of social content. So that's what they do. They put it up there and then just proliferate it through their existing channels. Whereas the traditional financial advisor typically works with their clients on a one-on-one basis, and they often require a fee for those services. So that's your typical accessibility, Ben. You've usually got Finfluencers that are one-to-many, and you've usually got traditional financial advisors that work one-to-one. So they're in different parts of the spectrum in terms of, and I guess that's probably why Finfluence is so effective, Ben, because that accessibility is instant and quick and easy to curate. And in the time it takes for you to drive from your house to get to the traditional financial planner's office, you could be online and you could be across 10, 20, 30 Finfluencers in the same time it takes for you to drive. So it's really move the dial. But that's the first one, how they differ, accessibility.
Yeah, number two then is obviously the platform in which they're operating on. So how do they distribute and get access or to their audience? So in terms of financial influencers, primarily operate with digital platforms such as social media, blogs, podcasts, and YouTube channels, like you mentioned earlier, Bryce. Now, they utilize these platforms to reach those wider audiences and engage with their followers quite often in real time. So it pretty much is a bit of a full-time job in terms of, they're trying to get content out as a minimum of one a day in terms of trying to get that reach. And of course, remembering that these platforms have algorithms, and how those algorithms react to the content they're producing ultimately means the number of eyeballs and ears that they get to. Now, a traditional financial planner would primarily operate in a more traditional sense where they would usually have an office, a bricks and mortar type location. They would potentially build their customer base through networking or providing some information to a small group of people, and then ultimately they get referrals, and then they build that out more slowly, and it's sort of a more a stable, slower pace in which they operate and utilize, and realize their ultimate goals of reaching and building out their client base.
Now, the third difference, Ben, is a big one, and we're going to have a bit to say on this later, so I'll just quickly touch on it now. It's around regulation. So traditional financial advisors, in short, are generally regulated heavily by government authorities and lots of compliance and lots of licensing, and they're typically held to fiduciary standards, right, which obligates them to act in the best interest of their client, right? But the financial influencers, generally by nature, are not subject to the same oversight. They pick up a camera, they put it to the platform. In some of these cases, platform, it only lasts for 24 hours. Sometimes it lasts as an evergreen. But generally speaking, they could voluntarily adhere to guidelines and ethical standards, which is a great sign.
Yep.
But typically speaking, we see a huge disparity in the regulations. So we've got a whole bit more to say on that later. So we might just move on to the next one.
Yeah, so point number 4 we wanted to highlight was expertise and credentials. Now, this is usually a glaring one. And so, as I unpack this particular story, let me just tell you a little narrative. We know friends and family members who have actually built their own home. And, they aren't necessarily licensed builders, but they've built either a hobby home or a lifestyle home, or they've built literally the home that their family lives in. Now, does that qualify them as a legitimate builder? I mean, do they know how to read architectural plans? Do they know how to follow those types of things? And so what we find in this particular space is, and especially in property investing, if people have bought 1 or 2 properties, all of a sudden they think they know everything about the investment market, and they use that as part of their experience and credentials and their expertise. But make no mistake, there is this, they are trying to position themselves as experts or authorities in this particular space. So when we think about traditional financial advisors, this is the differentiation here, and I think this is really important. They have formal education and training. So they've either done a degree level or a diploma level qualification in terms of their underlying qualification. So in a property investment space, qualified property investment advisor I would respect as the minimum standard that you would be looking at. And then any further university standards in regards to valuation or financial services knowledge, economic markets, those types, or building experiences, all of those could congregate into what we would call really strong financial knowledge and an understanding of property knowledge in those areas. So you could summarize those: finance areas, economics, and those related fields. Now, those also then tend to relate to certifications. So, in my case, I've got a diploma of mortgage broking. I've also a licensed real estate agent, and I'm a QPIA as an example. And if you're a financial planner, normally you're a certified financial planner or a CFP. And it also happens in accounting, where you've got chartered financial analysts. So that's a CFA or a CPA, those types of things that you can also do. So with that usually comes rigorous assessment. So you've got to pass an exam to be able to do that. And then you've got what we call ongoing requirements. So professional development, CDP they call them. So you've got to meet a minimum standard of points per year that's demonstrating that you've got that ongoing education. So you can understand that has a lot of cost associated with that. And there's a lot of time and effort and energy that goes into that. So you'd like to think that those people with these qualifications have a greater depth of knowledge. They're not sort of inch deep, mile wide. What they've got is deep knowledge, deep subject matter knowledge in terms of what they're doing. Now, a financial influencer, well, that's what I was just talking about before. Just because I've built a home doesn't make me a licensed builder, and being able to interpret detailed, plans associated with that. I might be able to how to know to build a frame, and I might be good at woodwork, but that ultimately doesn't necessarily make me that. So they come from various backgrounds, and again, even though they are demonstrating that they're practicing what they preach, there's very little formal qualifications in there. So if you do find a Finfluencer who's talking about a subject item that they have deep knowledge in because they've got qualifications in behind them, then I would continue to start listening to the knowledge that they've got, and then back that up with their experience to put those two things together as a consideration.
Yeah, well said. And I guess we practice a little bit of that on the podcast, Ben. When it becomes mortgage broking questions, I normally defer it to you because you're the qualified one and I'm not. I'm more the practical application in my own world, but when it comes to something deeply technical, we usually leave that for you for a couple of reasons. One, because you're the subject matter expert, but it's also responsible as we have a platform too to make sure that we're actually talking from that experience too. So something to think about. Compensation wise, this is a big one, right? Because your traditional financial advisor really, they charge fees for the service, whether that's an hourly fee, a flat fee, a percentage of assets under management. That makes sense, right? That's been going for scores and scores and scores of years, right? Whereas the financial influencer largely will either have a back end, Ben, where they can help, or they will curate an audience and then they will monetize the eyeballs. And
Yes.
that could be through sponsorship, advertising, affiliate marketing, which that's a big one, which might say, let's say I build a curated audience and then I have an affiliate relationship with a stockbroker. That stockbroker might pay me money for every client that I send their way, or every course that I send their way. That's affiliate marketing. I get a cut of everything that person earns. So 100% of the revenue they earn from that person, they will carve off a slice. Or I could sell some products or services. But generally speaking, they typically offer, in a one-to-many platform, their services for free to their audience in return for the curation of eyeballs, which they can channel it in many different ways. And if they don't have the back end, Ben, where they have a financial services business, which we'll talk about what it looks like to have a financial services business shortly. But if they don't have one in the background, generally they will need to do that through what I just said: sponsorship, advertising, affiliate marketing, or just selling some form of product or services that they've got. Could be a newsletter, Ben. A little hint of what we have to say a bit later on.
Could be newsletters. And also a lot of them also sell online courses. And, ultimately we fall into that bucket as well. We've done some of those online educational courses as well. So again, just making sure people understand how they potentially monetize it. So these financial influencers, these Finfluencers, are trying to make a living out of what they're doing. How much of a living that they want to make out of this, so they're in control of their own time. We have no problem with that. You know, entrepreneurship should be alive and well. Aspiring Australians should be alive and well. It's then just about how big they want that to be and how much do they want to make out of that particular story is, and how aggressive they get is ultimately where we start to sort of put amber and red flags around that. All right, let's move along now to personalization. So traditional financial advisors, and I think this is really important. So as a Finfluencer, I'll just quickly jump to the other side. I very rarely know anything about you, and I'm trying to sell you a generic understanding or a bit of information around that. Financial advisors must, through that fiduciary duty point that you were talking about before, they must put the client's best interest. So if I use an example of a mortgage broker, there's got to be a responsible lending obligation to actually talk about credit and making sure that that credit is appropriate for that particular person at that particular time. Financial planners who deal in financial instruments or financial products as per ASIC and the Corporations Act, they absolutely have an obligation to align their recommendations to the goals, to that personalized financial plan. And that is really the main separation in terms of what it looks like. So you go goal setting first, and then you do the design of the strategy timed on those current plans and future plans for the client. Now, that takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of energy on both parties. So as a trusted advisor, I'm trying to tap in to the goals of the household and so forth. So those programs can take weeks of discovery and then review and then prioritization and then synchronization of that based on cash flows and the ability to actually achieve those goals. Whereas in terms of financial influencers, very general. Okay, and they can often use, some of their own personal examples. So things like shopping examples, they're all great. And I definitely love the idea of maximizing every dollar spent. So I'm a big fan of some of these people who help households do budgeting and sort of make their dollar stretch as far as possible. But when it gets more technical in terms of when I trap that surplus and I move into the investment, into that investment sphere, then all of a sudden it becomes really interesting in terms of that, because there's a real problem there.
So I guess, Ben, to your point around personalisation, there's a thing, tips, and I got this, I think it was a couple of weeks, I got the aha moment around the difference between tips and training. And the tips, there's problems with tips that you get. They're just snacks. They often lack context, because what do you do before, what do you do after? So here's an example. Here's a mantra on the property couch: only buy established property. Okay, that's a tip, right? It's not training, because the question is, well, what do I do with that? What do I do before, and what do I do after? Once I know that I should buy established property. So, I guess that is something that the Finfluencer space has a lot of, Ben. Lots of tips, lots of tricks. If you go onto our feed, you'll see we've got lots of tips and tricks as well. But ultimately, if it is without the context of what do I do before and what do I do after, it's very, very difficult. So here's another tip we'll do. Just pay interest only on your principal place of residence. Wow, why? Well, because you can put money in an offset account, and typically speaking, it does the same as paying P&I. Although that was a tip that we gave maybe 5 years ago, Ben, but then the environment changed, where the interest rate for interest only and the interest rate for P&I changed. So that tip that you received back then, without context of what to do before and what to do after and what's on the bigger scheme of things, if that's still in the best interest for you to do, is really important for you to understand. So I guess it's just a little cautionary tale about receiving tips if you don't know what to do in context of those things before and after.
Yeah, and that is a perfect example of credit advice. So we've got to be very careful. If you go back and listen to those episodes, we're sort of saying, speak to your mortgage broker, get further advice on that particular point, because what you want to make sure that we're doing is staying within the law. Because if a financial Finfluencer decided to talk about offset accounts and talk about redraw accounts and make a recommendation like interest only on a principal place of residence, they're giving credit advice. And ultimately, that is very dangerous, and it's in breach of the laws and the regulations. So that's where ASIC is quite interested, and we'll talk more about those frameworks. So certainly, cash flow management and simple budgeting, that can be the domain of if that falls outside of that regulatory capture area. But certainly, when you start talking about things like that, you want to be able to back yourself up as someone who's qualified to talk about it, i.e., holds an Australian credit license. It has authorised representatives under that, and also I'm diploma qualified in that area, and I have all of my qualifications to be able to talk about credit in that respect. And a lot of Finfluencers don't, and that's the risk and the reason why ASIC are so interested in protecting consumers in that space.
And so they should. So, folks, we are talking about the rise of the financial influencer as a result of Jen's question to me on Instagram. We've covered what a financial influencer is. We've also given you 6 things to think about how Finfluencers differ from traditional financial advisors. Number 1 was accessibility, then it was platform, regulation, expertise, and credentials. Number 5 was how they get compensated. Number 6 was the level of personalization. So, Ben, we'll kind of pivot now to who is most likely to be seeking advice from financial influencers, aka Finfluencers?
Yeah, well, I think these days it's very clear that, you need to have some sort of technical knowledge. You need to be able to get access to these types of things. So we're talking about really people who have smartphones, mobile devices, tablets, and they are in that sort of age range from 12 to 43. Now, we know that, even people who use our More platform, we've got some awesome people who are on that platform in their 80s. And so it's great to see those small number of people looking at how they're going to manage their money. So we've got millennials who are in that sort of 1981 to 1996. And then we've got Gen Zs who are sitting at 1997 to 2012. And now the next generation, which is Alpha, which is just starting to get that exposure in that particular space as well. So we talk about them as being digital natives. So they grew up with a bit of technology. They're highly comfortable with the digital platforms. And they're obviously, these platform providers are trying, what's their KPIs? Their KPIs, how they measure their success of their platform, which makes their business worth billions of dollars, is time on site. Okay, because how do they make their money? Well, if people are on the site more often, they've got control of the eyeballs. And then ultimately, that means that their advertising revenue is where they generate most of their dollars for their profitability in their business as well. So that's really important. Now, they also, by behavioural point of view, they prefer online content versus traditional content. So traditional content might be TV, might be radio, might be print. The ability to be on socials is you can get certain information on demand. You can scroll quicker. You can get that instant fix in terms of what that looks like. And they are more attuned to follow these idols like Mr. Beast and, those types of things, as opposed to where you might get, traditional people who are a little bit older might have not had the same sort of connection. What Bryce and I, had experienced around our fans, we could only see them on the news or we could only just see them in movies. We didn't have instant access to them, whereas all of these influencers now, they can get out to their communities very, very quickly. And it does feel like, in a lot of cases, that they're having one-to-one relationships. And so that's really skewed this dynamic aspect of it. If we didn't see them on the news or we didn't see them playing sport live or we didn't see them in the movies, we just didn't see them. Nowadays, ultimately, they're fully available to us. And I think that's led to, this belief system that I'm just going to trust everything that I see and hear through these platforms because I've just got so much of it available to me.
And I think, Ben, if I think about my own personal journey, people feel like they know me better from the podcast than they do from the television shows. So it's just changing that platform.
Yeah.
They hear about my kids. They know that I follow Fremantle. They know that you and I have banter about sport. There's just that level of intimacy that you get from being in
Yeah.
the traditional social media platforms that you're right. We had to get a trash talk magazine, or hopefully get an interview on the news or something to do with those Hollywood A-listers in the past, or the people that we idolized, right? So other thing for preferring the online content is, because if you think about the most business channels, they just give you market updates, whereas the new breed of investor wants education. You think about our podcast, our audience wants education.
Yeah.
They just don't want updates. And lockdown gave people more time to look at their finances, so they went to YouTube and other social media platforms for that. But so there's this really strong desire for financial education. They don't necessarily want the path that the previous generation went, the 40-40-40 plan, the 40 minutes to work for 40 hours a week for 40 years. They want new. They want try different ways. And I guess YouTube, Ben, how to make money online, you will get taken down a rabbit warren to a million different videos and a million different channels, right? So, but there is that desire to be proactive about their financial future. And this particular generation group, as you said, from 81 through, they really, really value financial education, so they're seeking out the resources. So it kind of makes sense, right? You only have to rewind to 2008 and see that there was some distrust of financial institutions caused by the GFC and subsequent economic challenges, whereas they perceive influencers as more relatable and authentic. And I think that's important and highlights what you're saying before. They feel they're more relatable and authentic sources of financial advice. So if you combine that desire for financial education, the distrust of financial institutions, and it leads to the preference for authenticity. So those who share personal stories and experiences and struggles and how that all relates to money management versus, this is important distinction, versus the more traditional financial advisor who feels more formal and I guess as a result can feel a little bit more impersonal. So it's just that opportunity that you have to be unique and transparent and authentic and day-to-day and human and what's going on, versus walking into a bricks and mortar scenario and getting your traditional formality. So it kind of makes sense that millennials and Gen Z are going down that path. But Ben, it's not just millennials and Gen Zs, although they are most likely to be seeking out Finfluencers. There's a bit of a catch-all, isn't there?
Yeah, well, there absolutely is. I mean, in terms of how do we get education or information out to people, that's changed radically over the last 10 or 15, 20 years, right? With the introduction of smartphones and so forth. So all of our educational habits have changed. We've now moved to a more on-demand society. So you can really understand it's all been democratized. It hasn't been controlled by the big media companies. We can now get accessibility to it. So it's also, why have we seen the rise of these Finfluencers? Is because, well, I can relate to these people. I'm like these people. I can do what they're doing. So they then think about having a go at it. And that's ultimately why we've got hundreds, if not thousands, of these people, because they're also seeing stories of kids opening up presents and then, they're making millions of dollars from the advertisers and the manufacturers of those because they've got eyeballs. And so it is absolutely the eyeball economy. And remembering that through these social envy platforms, they're all rented eyeballs in terms of what that looks like. And I agree with you, Bryce, in terms of, if I go, my fear of going to see a financial professional is a couple of things. They're going to judge me, number one, and two, they may not say that, my dreams and that are possible. So don't kill my dreams. Don't judge me. And so there's very much this whole sense of, and this is what, these Finfluencers do. No judgment here. So just I'm likable, I'm relatable, and the information I might be sharing might be 80% based in fact, but the reality is that's why people gravitate to that. We buy stories all the time. We tend to have time to learn to like you before we then commit to you. And then pretty much whatever you tell me, I'm then going to have sunk cost bias in because I'm committed to you. And that's the danger in this space in terms of, whereas a trusted financial advisor should be able to sit here and say, hey, I'm going to high five you on the things you're doing really well, but I'm going to eyeball you and challenge you in areas that you need to improve, because We need to be able to trap this surplus to be able to make your lifestyle by design and your $2,000 a week a reality. And so that's the jarring effect where people are like, no judgment over here, I'm going to keep going. They keep reinforcing my belief systems. And there's sometimes dangers in reinforcing certain belief systems. And that's why it's so dynamic and so interesting in this space.
When you give a generic video, Ben, it's possible for everyone. You don't have to get specific. So, all right. So here's some. I guess if we go back to Jen's original question, Ben, it was around. Would love to hear you talk about this and see what to look out for. Right? Can you do a podcast on the rise of the financial influencers and what to look out for? So here's a couple of things that we have interpreted that question from Jen to be. So some Finfluencer red flags that we want to chat about. And the first one I want to talk about is too good to be true, right? So it's the get rich quick mentality with minimal effort. There is very many you only have to go onto Netflix, Ben, and watch some of the social media documentaries. There's lots of these Finfluencers who are renting the lifestyle. They go and take photos in front of cars that are not theirs. They go and take photos in front of houses that are not theirs. They go on holidays that they can't afford, all in the name of getting these shots, right? So the idea that you can get rich with minimal effort is really down to an incredibly lucky few. Lotto winners, some people in the right place at the right time. But get rich with minimal effort is a very, very rare occurrence, folks. So I think that should be the guiding light. And so the too good to be true needs to sort of wrap around some terms, Ben, and lots of claims. Now, my favorite platform bar none is YouTube, Ben. I'm on YouTube a lot. It is the free university for any particular topic you are ever interested in, and I love it. But you need to be able to curate which ones are the best. But here's claims that I hear. So I watch a lot of business, I watch a lot of marketing, I watch a lot of investing. And so a lot of people buy ads within the videos that I'm watching, Ben, and I see this all the time. Foolproof, guaranteed, no fail, no money down, no deposit. These are flags that suggest at the very least you should be approaching the content with a grain of salt until proven otherwise, because they are usually terms that are thrown around and bandied around by people who are in the get rich quick lane, Ben. So too good to be true is something we should be well and truly mindful of.
And if I could just put some icing on your point there, Bryce, the whole concept of, human behavior, and this is the psychology of money and the psychology of our behaviors and our purchasing behaviors. The reason why they show that flashy lifestyle, the private jets, the cars, the houses, all of those luxury things, is because we buy with emotion and then later on we justify with logic. And so they are trapping us into, well, if I could be like them, then I could have that lifestyle. So it's highly desirable, it's highly emotional, and that plays with that psychology. So if you've got someone who's educating you on the facts, proof of data, historical performance, and so I'm a big fan of YouTube too. I think you could learn amazing things, but there's also university courses that you get free. There's professors who are talking, and so things like TED Talks. And so whenever I'm thinking about a topic, I also they've curated some of the best experts. So I'm going to listen to someone on YouTube, but I'm going to go over to the TED Talk and see if I can correlate that. Or, there's professors or academia or data or whatever. So I'm not just going to rely on that one source in terms of what that looks like. So that is a good example of, not just basically blindly trusting and blindly believing what's being said. Number two is the hard sell. And so this comes into that classic case of it should be a value add first, right? So ultimately, what value are you giving me? And then what sort of products are you then going to push, constantly down my throat for me to be able to do that? And in terms of there's always something being sold. So, it's not like they are just constantly educating you. And then there's some opportunity for information and further, knowledge to be gained later on. It's just constant, because this is where the agenda gets turned. The agenda gets turned into, they are just hard sell, right? They are sales. And so that should turn you off as a red flag when it comes to that hard sell. And that's, paid promotions, pushy. And remembering, if a lot of them are making big money through their sponsorships or referral payments and kickbacks and commissions, that they work on a model. For every dollar I spend, I'm making $1.20. So I'm ultimately going to keep spending more and more money. So they'll be retargeting you. They'll be following you around the internet, everyone. You're like, how can they afford to do this? Because guess what? You're the product, and they're doing that hard sell. And so for every dollar they spend on advertising, they're still making 20 cents, and they'll keep doing it until the cows come home.
Now, folks, just on YouTube alone, there's people who have, if they've got over 1 million subscribers, and they're providing really great content that people stick around for, those ads that cycle through when you're watching the video, the actual channel owner gets a portion of that ad revenue, and this can add up. I got mates who have got YouTube channels that are significant. One of my mates is approaching 2 million subscribers, right?
Wow.
So, and he's earning sort of, well, I won't disclose, but let's just say $2,000 a week looks insignificant compared to what they're earning from the checks that they're getting from YouTube, just for getting people to look at the videos in their channel so that YouTube can serve up ads within the viewing, so they can obviously pay a portion of that ad. So, folks, it is big business for a lot of these Finfluencers who get it right. Because if you can curate eyeballs, there's plenty of people who want to pay you money to get in front of those eyeballs. So too good to be true. Ben's talked about the hard sell. The other one is the lack of transparency, right? So if you can't get a read on their background, their qualifications, any potential conflicts of interest they have, that is something that you'd want to make sure that you lean into to see that you can do that right. And taking info into direct messages, DMs, rather than in the public forum, because then there's no accountability when it's one-on-one, because you've gone from a one-to-many platform, which allows you to be assessed by a lot of people. Then you take it into the one-to-one realm. That is something that some people have legitimate ways to get them into their DMs, Ben. So they might just say, hey, listen, leave. I see a lot of them where it says comment, workshop, comment, property, comment something and I'll send you a DM. And it's just their way of actually getting access to the individual and send them some details. I mean, at face value, that's fine. But when you're in the Finfluencer space and you're trying to then give advice within the DM space, I think that can be a dangerous place to play. So what else, Ben?
Yeah, so another big red flag, and hopefully this should be really easy to identify, is that they're talking about high-risk strategies. So they're talking about really quick get-rich-quick opportunities, or I'm teaching my students how to make $25,000 a week. That's one of my favorites.
Yeah.
In terms of, so they build these student communities and they're teaching it. Now you sort of honestly think, for these people who supposedly have all of these riches and all of these millions of dollars, why are they doing that? Like, why do they need to keep more students? I don't get it. Now, they may be very, very much love the education piece of it. I know you and I.
Yeah, we get the criticism too, don't we, Ben? Where people say, well, there's only some point where you want to make a difference and you want to create a legacy for others. And
that's right. Paying it forward, which is our origin story, which we'll talk about. Okay, and then obviously, so then you've got the crypto worlds and you've got all of these new things. Now, AI is the big one out there at the moment. So, how do you make a course using AI, and then you can sell that course online? There's a lot of that sort of stuff going on there. And in real terms, it's like, you've just got to really say to yourself, this does seem like a high-risk strategy. It's not, if anything's around get rich quick, that should be an enormous amount of red flags. And if you go to the ASIC website, which is the Money Smart website, if it's too good to be true, if it sounds too good to be true, it usually is too good to be true. So always make sure that the claims being made around unrealistic returns, and we're seeing it in property space at the moment, where effectively what's happening in the property space at the moment at that entry-level price point is that these investment groups are actually moving the market, right? So they are effectively pumping that low end of the market, and then they're telling people, and then other copycat advisory businesses and buyers agents are going in there and buying. And that is pumping the market. And this is a point that I will spend a fair bit of time talking about this year. voting machine versus weighing machine. Ultimately, what they are doing is they are artificially inflating the market, and so you've got to justify to yourself is, well, where's that long-term return value? Because if you're the last in, and ultimately, I've got some great examples of markets in mining towns where you've seen that sort of stuff happening. So, that they are pumping the market and artificially inflating it. So if you're coming into a market where it's predominantly investors in the property space, be very, very careful, because effectively, if there's no underlying owner-occupier buyer there and it's all investors, I promise you're going to see some red ink on the future value of your property.
Very good. All right. The next one is next red flag is emphasis on short-term gains. It typically creating some form of success in the money world requires long-term planning, right? But quite often chasing these quick profits is what is espoused.
Yeah.
It's a spectrum, right? Some people have the ability to make short gains in short amount of time, but they are well and truly increasing themselves on the risk scale. So that's something for you to think about too. And usually it's just a headline thing that they talk about. So you're making a profit, so it's X minus Y, but they're not talking about recycle cost, Ben, capital gains tax, agents fees, any of the closing costs that you have out of, using property as an example, and then the reinvestment into another purchase, right? So it's all about, look what I made in 5 minutes, sell out, get the next one. But they're not actually factoring in how much heavy lifting the next investment needs to do just to break even on not actually moving moving these properties on, holding them in the first place. So, so they're only sort of mitigating known risks, but they're not mitigating any of the unknown risks like GFC, COVID. What's the next one? No one knew GFC was coming before it came, Ben. No one knew COVID was coming before it came. So the next one, as we stand here, we don't know what it is.
We don't know what that black swan event's going to be.
But it'll be something. And we'll all go, how do we not see it? Well, we didn't see COVID, we didn't see GFC, so it's just normal part of it, right? So, but the emphasis on short-term gains is something that the greatest investor of all time, well, arguably the longest investor of all time, some people have got greater percentage returns, but the greatest investor of all time, Uncle Warren, has just been playing for a long time and never gets involved in any sort of short-term cyclical market cycle headline game because they know that the game that needs to be played is holding on to these assets for some time. So number 5, Ben, was emphasis on short-term gains is a red flag for Finfluencer activity.
Yeah, don't fall for it because it's tempting. We all know we don't want to miss out on that share tip or that little idea that people have. So it does play on our psychology. So always be strong in terms of not getting sucked into the next big fad in terms of what that looks like. The final one here, Bryce, for us is really around this whole idea of we've always tried to pass on our knowledge. Now, 4,000 odd purchases, 4,500 odd plans, a team of over 100 people, ironing, sharpening iron, constantly working in that. And we get the privilege of taking all of that knowledge from our team and passing it through us into what we share and what we teach here on the Property Couch. So, we've always tried to say at the end of the day, the hero is our community who take action. But what we see as big red flags in this Finfluencer space is they're acting like the hero. They're acting like the superstar. They're not necessarily in there to guide you, the ones who we're scared of. There are some good Finfluencers that we just think they're calm, they're methodical, they're evidence-based, they back it up with the research that they're talking about. All of that's, so there's some good ones out there, but these ones in terms of red flags are they're putting themselves as the hero. It's all about them. They're the ones who are potentially showing their shop front as being unrealistic portrayal of lifestyle. They're flaunting their extravagant lifestyles. Their narrative is like, I just made this play and I made a lazy $100,000 last night. Blah blah blah. Just be very, very careful of those people because it's very easy to be enticed by them, and especially when you're young and you have no financial strength in your financial literacy, and you don't have a lot of investment experience, it can be very enticing to see how successful they are. But also remember this: for every one Mr. Beast who is the king of influence on these platforms, I am talking, this guy is a genius in this space, there's probably 100 million people who are also trying to be him, and he's one. So it's not even 1%, it's 0.0000.000.1 that are people that. So be mindful in terms of what that is. So these others who are trying to fake it till they make it, be really careful of that. So the more extravagance and extroverted of their wealth and that they're showing you, I'd move on to another Finfluencer.
Yeah. And it's always about the I always think the life hack is this, Ben. Just see what evidence you can find of people that they've actually helped. So it's not about what they've done and the lifestyle and the amount of trips they're on and all that. How many people they helped, right? Can you go to their website and is there any testimonials? Is there Google reviews? Is there actually any evidence to suggest that they have been able to show someone else how to do it? Because if they can do it, good on you. Well done. But if you've got no evidence of being able to show anyone else how to do it, what value are you? You're not a mentor. You're just a content creator. So really, it's about understanding that there's 3 phases of investing. There's 3 phases of property investing. There's 3 phases of share investing. There's 3 phases of investing in general. One is the accumulation phase. The second phase is when you're reducing the LVR, ideally down to 0. And then the third phase is lifestyle by design. It's not that complicated. But if anyone wants to get to point 3 without doing point 1 and then point 2, Ben, all the best. But there hasn't been too much evidence of people doing that. So, all right, so let's move on. So what does ASIC have to say about Finfluencers, the Australian Securities and Investment Commission? Well, they discuss, talking about financial products and services online. And the big question is, are you operating within the law? Right? Because there's 3 things that you need to think about when you're talking about are you operating within the law. First of all is financial product advice. Secondly, are you dealing by arrangement or arranging? And third, are you dealing in misleading or deceptive conduct? Now, misleading and deceptive conduct, here's what the law has to say about this, because this catches everyone. The law prohibits conduct that is misleading or deceptive or likely to mislead or deceive in relation to financial products or services. You don't need to be licensed to breach the misleading or deceptive provision. So this is for everyone who's in the Finfluencer space. You should have this as the baseline. This is where most of the Finfluencers get themselves into trouble, Ben, is if they violate this very fundamental human trait that you should have interest in other people, is to not be misleading and deceptive in nature. But Ben, what about financial product advice and dealing by arranging should people be thinking about?
Yeah, so the law in terms of financial products, so under the Corporations Act, there are a series of products that they have classed as a financial product. And it says, so advice around that is a recommendation or statement of opinion which is intended to influence or which could reasonably be regarded as being intended to influence a person making a decision in relation to those financial products. So what are we talking about here? The classic ones are really simple. So you've got managed investment schemes, you've got shares, you've got superannuation, you've got personal insurances, obviously direct shares if you're giving advice on those types of things as well, so equities and those types of things. So they're the main sort of financial products. The challenge we have in the residential or direct private residential space is that it's not a licensed investment product. And it's very hard for it to be because lots of people buy real estate for owner-occupied purposes. So it's very hard to regulate. But that is why we are seeing a lot of finfluencing happening in property and spruiking happening online at the moment because they don't get caught by that law. But here's where it gets interesting. Dealing by arrangement. So what the law says here, arranging for a person to deal in a financial product, such as buying or selling a financial product, is a financial service. So in other words, if I'm a Finfluencer and I have someone approach me who sort of says, oh, I see you've got a big audience there. Do you reckon you could talk to them about setting up a self-managed super fund? But just talk in statements of fact here, read this script in terms of the pros and cons, but then refer them to us So in other words, send them on to us and we'll take care of them. By recommending that supplier, that Finfluencer is potentially in breach of the law under this dealing by arrangement. So it's really important in terms of who Finfluencers, because they're getting paid in a lot of respects, whether it be marketing, advertising, access to their community, kickbacks, commissions in terms of, through the affiliate marketing stuff that Bryce was talking about. So it really is quite important to understand that those laws do exist. And we know that there are cases and examples of where ASIC has successfully prosecuted Finfluencers in this space.
Before we get to that, Ben, because you've got a specific case study that you want to talk to, there are some challenges for ASIC regulators, and there's a few things. One is monitoring difficulties. So a lot of these platforms have live videos, and my son's favorite is Snapchat, right? And stuff just disappears. So I guess monitoring that is very, very difficult for sort of getting across that direct messaging. So there's one. There's two, there's interpretation barriers, right? So slang and emojis that some Finfluencers use. So the nuances around whether the conduct is actually unlicensed advice or misleading is very challenging. There's also limitations on protection, right? So ASIC, Australian Securities and Investment Corporation or Commission, that's for Australian products only. So very difficult to monitor and police for international products. So that's a challenge. And then you've got cryptocurrency regulation. So there's a lack of clear regulation around these digital assets. And so therefore there's difficulty in protecting consumers from Finfluencers promoting cryptocurrencies. So whilst the Australian Securities and Investment Commission has a very clear mandate, being able to execute on that mandate is the challenge here. And we haven't even talked about resourcing, Ben. How many resources do they have available to actually get into the marketplace and see these people? So clearly, the more profile that you would have as a Finfluencer, the more you get on the radar. So in the research for today's chat, I read a lot of articles, Ben, and there was an article from one of the guys at ASIC, and as these Finfluencers start to rise to the top, they definitely get on the radar of the regulator. But it's not all straightforward for them, Ben. There's definitely a challenge in them trying to make sure, okay, are you operating within the law? And then secondly, how do we make sure that you are operating within the law? That's not straightforward. But
it's not. And to your point, it takes a lot of resources. So remembering there are a lot of people who get into Finfluencing with valid intentions. They believe that they're good money managers and they can teach people how to manage their money, and they ultimately want to help others, right? And so that's great intentions. But there are going to be those people who get in there with basically high self-interest. And the example that I wanted to talk about is a gentleman by the name of Tyson Robert Schultz. And effectively what happened in terms of his situation, he was known as the ASX Wolf, right? And so he was absolutely a financial influencer or Finfluencer, and he went through a process of building up a community, showcasing his unbelievable lifestyle, his cars and his houses and his beach locations, and all living the best life. And so he then obviously started to monetize, his success in share trading. And so he set up a share trading newsletter, and people would pay his business to subscribe to access to his membership fees, $500, $1,000, $1,500. And he would ultimately then give share tips and share recommendations. Now we know shares are a licensed investment product. And so he was saying, I'm just doing a newsletter and a membership. So he thought he wasn't giving investment advice. But on the back of that, it's alleged that he was also pumping and dumping. So in other words, what you do there is you just before you send out the newsletter or you send out the recommendation, you buy the stock, and then the stock jumps based on that information getting out there through the viral social nets, and it pops in value, and then you take your profits and you get out. And then those people who are getting in at the end, which is what I was talking before about in terms of we're seeing a little bit of pumping of the entry-level property markets around the country, but that's all being investor-led. Where does that sit in 5 or 10 years and 15 years from a performance point of view? That's the ultimate judgment about the voting machine versus the weighing machine. So long and the short of it, ASIC took him to court, won the court case, and ultimately he was barred from ever providing financial advice or services. There's also the fact that he was fined around $450,000 to pay the legal costs for ASIC because they also won the case. And he's now claiming that he's bankrupt and he can't afford to make those repayments. But yet, if you follow him on social media, here he is gallivanting around Europe, trying to again build up a new influencing environment and get more of these people. So that clearly says red flag to me in terms of whose interests is he he knows the formula, and that is show the big success stories, pump up all of that that emotional connection, and then start buying whatever I have to sell. Is what he's trying to do. So he's claiming to ASIC that he can't make the payments. ASIC are basically taking him to bankruptcy, but ultimately he still seems to be moving around Europe like he's got unlimited cash. So that is an interesting story. But that's the example of the types of people who, whether they're shock jocks or they're really aggressive in their marketing, there's a lot of self-interest in terms of what it means for them, not necessarily the outcomes, the long-term outcomes. And remember, we think in decade, very conservative outcomes, whether that's going to materialize for someone like that.
Now, Ben, it's also documented in some of the journalist reports about Robert Schultz, is that his mental state isn't that great, right? Now, there's two, but and I want to be very respectful here, but there's one path that says that might be a strategy for avoiding the fees and all that sort of stuff. So that's possible. But let's just assume it's not a strategy, Ben. Let's assume that he is genuinely suffering from some mental hardship here, which is to not be taken lightly. I think it's an important lesson for people to understand that here's a guy who his highlights reel looks pretty amazing, but his behind the scenes is causing him some grief and some real challenges in his own mental well-being. So all that glitters is not always gold, right? So it's important for people to realize that people think that the shiny, the sparkly, all that sort of stuff is where the happiness is found. We've talked about this ad nauseum over the journey, Ben, and if you talk to anyone who's worth their salt in terms of positive mental attitude, it's generally experiences and the people that you surround yourself and the respect and the admiration that you get from adding value to other people versus having fast car, fast house, fast lifestyle. So I think that's super important for people to remember at the very least. Here's a guy who was at the pinnacle of Finfluencing, Ben, and by all reports, not doing so great.
Well, call me harsh, Bryce, but it's all self-inflicted in his particular example, and he's lost a lot of people a lot of money, and he's been obviously fined. And he's not living up to those responsibilities. And it sounds like the way in which he's operating right now, he hasn't learnt his lesson. And so it's those types of people that really we don't need in financial services and in the world itself, because there are unfortunately a lot of gullible people that get sucked into people like this through their scamming and that type of thing. And ultimately they are stealing money. And so, as much as he might be claiming, challenges, which to your point, if people are legitimate and they're trying to help others and it's still not working for them and they're putting all of that pressure on themselves to be successful, that I think is a legitimate case. But in this particular case, I think this he has obviously no self-consciousness. He doesn't care about who he steals money from. I hope he ends up in jail the way he keeps operating.
So if we go back to Mindset Minute, history doesn't repeat itself. Humans repeat themselves. We're seeing that this story with this particular individual, we rewind 20 years, you'll find a similar story. Rewind 20 years again, you'll find a similar story. But here's the important point. Fast forward 20 years, we'll find another story. Fast forward 40 years, we're going to find another story, because that cycle of fear and greed will continue to move throughout the generations, because what happens is people go from being born to going to school to getting their first job to then getting enticed by the big lights. And so the cycle continues. But Ben, what about real estate? We've talked about a guy who's doing securities. We've touched on crypto there. Here's the challenge. The Corporations Act covers financial products, But here's the thing about residential real estate. It is the only market in the world, the only investment market in the world that is not dominated by investors. So therefore, it's not a licensed financial product. Therefore, it's not covered under the Corporations Act. Therefore, it is the playground for the spruiker. And so then all you have to do is rewind back to the first episode of this podcast, Ben, and then start moving forward, because we've talked a lot about what that looks like. But herein lies the challenge for the Finfluencer in the property space. They are not necessarily covered by ASIC under the provisions of financial products. They are covered under misleading and deceptive conduct, but that's very, very difficult to prove. But to Jen's point earlier, she's asked about Finfluencers in general, but we're starting to see in the last couple of weeks, we started to be vocal about the new age, the new tactics, the new ways that the spruikers are coming into the game. But here is the point where something slips through the net. If you are in the property space, it is very, very, very difficult for you to have to follow a code of conduct, if there isn't any, which is why we have been ambassadors for people to look for people who have some form of qualification. Now, qualification doesn't mean that they have the experience, but if you can find the qualification and the experience mixed together, that is the nirvana, and that's how you protect yourself against the property-related Finfluencer, Ben.
Yeah, I'd like to summarise it like this. I mean, and I've told my story before. But yes, I'd built a multi-million-dollar property portfolio before I started, right? And everyone's got to start somewhere. So, but I was playing with my own money, and ultimately I was constantly, accountable to myself. When I'm playing with other people's money, I'm accountable to them. And so what you're trying to do is, just because you've done it yourself, the builder example I used before, doesn't mean you know all of the nuances. So same with real estate agents. If you're asking for even a buyer's agent for investment advice from a buyer's agent, what do they know about investing? What do they know about, the broader concepts of that? So you've got to have lots of questions for them. And so if you're a buyer's agent, but you've got a QPIA, then that's great, because at least you've gone and done some, education and training and reading around what's required of me in terms of understanding the goals of my customer and the outcomes that my customers are looking for. So that's really important. If you're dealing directly with a QPIA, what you want to be doing is what sort of modeling, what sort of supporting evidence. So remember, always evidence-based research in terms of backing up what they're looking for, and try and also look for longer term returns where it's going to be measured over the next 20, 30, 40 years, not necessarily an instant sugar hit. Don't get me wrong, timing in the market in certain markets does add value. It's always good to get a quick run on the board, but you're going to be judged and it's going to be weighed over the long term, not just in the short term. So I think they're a couple of critical takeaways that I'd be looking for in terms of qualification, professional indemnity, all of those things that, come into play, because being regulated and running to the laws and having licenses like we do, we've got an AFSL, so Australian Financial Services license. We've got a licensed real estate. We've got multiple real estate agent license because it's state-based. We've got an Australian credit license to operate the way in which we do. And those things and the compliance, there's tens of thousands of dollars in terms of making sure professional development, ongoing accreditations and so forth. So there's a lot to
getting those to work symbiotically, Ben, is a challenge too. Because some of the things that you can do, like in a financial planning license, you can't combine newsletter communication to your clients with other information, through our property. There are so many nuances around
lots of compliance.
And note to anyone who wants to build an integrated service model like ours, make sure that you're really, really passionate about it, because there's a lot of moving parts. So if we say to Jen, Ben, who's asked us the original question that's kicked off this conversation today, what should Jen do moving forward, right? And by extension, everyone in our community. But we've got a couple of thoughts on this. One is to prioritize those with history in the game. Right, so I'm documented of being involved since October of 1998, Ben. You're a little earlier than me. So if you do your maths, we're quarter of a century plus each between us. So that's the first tick. But that's not everything. But what it does is it says you've experienced more than one cycle, and ultimately you've experienced downturns. Because for a lot of the journey, for a lot of alphas and Gen Zs, it's been pretty good sunshine for most of the time. Have someone who is prioritizing long-term thinking and has disclosed bruises in their record and how they've adjusted, right? Because we haven't been 100% perfect over the journey, Ben. But what we've done is we've had a look at where we have bruises, and we make sure that we adjust and make sure that we learn from those. In our lane, we want you to be PIPA qualified, right? Ideally, because there is a code of conduct, there is some basics, there is a minimum level of education that's involved in being PIPA qualified. So we are unashamedly advocates of people being PIPA qualified if they're talking in the investment space. And then you want to be beware of a ton of platitudes that you can get, Ben. I'll riff off a couple, and then maybe you riff off a couple. But I think when the GFC hit, Ben, I had be fearful when others are greedy, and be fearful when others are greedy, and greedy when others are fearful. I had it printed out on my monitor because all I was a property counsellor through the GFC. Should I hold? Should I hold? Should I hold? And I didn't know. But it's actually easier to say than it is to do, right? So it is actually easier to say than it is to do. So you want to be beware of any platitudes that come across, because not all property doubles in value, and not all property that goes up in value in the short term is a great investment. So there's some real sort of deciphering that you need to do.
All of that plays into one of the big heuristics that is very powerful with investing, and that is recency bias. So when you're seeing share market doing really well or crypto doing really well, and you're in a property, or you're even seeing good properties doing really well, and your property sitting there flat, you go, oh, I want to be getting some of that action over there. So that's the challenge for people to sort of think in longer terms. That's why, to your point, that Warren and Charlie, when he was around, also they don't even look at the short-term economic story. They just think, what's my margin of safety? Where is the barrier of entry? What sort of moat are these people building? So in our case, it's land value, scarcity, location, economic interest, human behavior, those types of things that we mesh in to our investment thesis, and how we do that, backed by the evidence based of 40 or 50 years of returns. So that's always really important. Now, to your point, what are the platitudes? Even good properties don't always go up every year, right? And this whole idea of hot spotting predictors, just remember that you can pump a market. So if a lot of those predictions, and everyone downloads the reports, and you only need 30 or 40 or 50 investors all wanting to buy in a particular area, if 10,000 or 100,000 people get a newsletter, and the number one property location to buy this is suburb X in this state, if you get 40 or 50 people out of that 10,000 list, that's pumping that market up. So it is always really important that if you're buying into a market, is to try and understand the number of investors that are buying into that market versus the number of owner occupiers, because that's the error that I'm seeing right now in those particular markets, in terms of what that looks like. Forecasters, they do get it wrong. I mean, it's very difficult. It is the dismal science, as we call it, economics, because it's the study of social interactions, human behavior, business behavior, regulation that can also, influence economic demand and supply aspects of that. So that's always difficult. And then obviously the other one's about stories about growth corridors, and that's the oversupply of land in those particular areas. So it really is important to understand that. And any one of these gurus or property practitioners who are just focused on the short-term gains that they're making, again, that's that recency. So we lock in on, oh, look at this one, it's gone up 50 or 60% in 6 or 12 months. Everyone can play in that game. We've got 4,500 purchases, or over 4,000 purchases, my apologies. And we could cherry pick hundreds of properties that have gone up by, double-digit growth in the first 6 weeks but we choose not to do that. We choose to basically just say we're looking after one customer at a time, and we are literally trying to get them the very best property that we can, that's going to perform over the decades, not just over the next short term.
So the final word is this, folks. Under the definition that we've just spent the last hour or so describing, Ben, myself, and the Property Couch platform, we are Finfluencers. We never started out thinking that was going to be the game. We are documented as being started back in 2015. There was only about 3 other podcasts in our lane, Ben. And we legitimately started that podcast just as an exercise for you and I to refine what we know, to give back, and to try and help some of our clients not get burnt, right? There is a dark side and a light side, right? So we've obviously spent a bit of time. We interpreted Jen's question today around talking about the dark side of influencers. There is a light side as well. There are some really good people in the game. There are some people that if you apply some of the filters that we talked about, long range, they've got no hubris, they're humble, they've got a long-term perspective, go and seek them out. And there are plenty out there who are out. Obviously, we self-assess as being on the light side. You get to be the judge, but there are plenty of good people out there that you can go and get your information from. But we obviously got to beware the dark side. So here's our invitation to everyone listening to this. If someone's been listening to us for a long time, they've probably already done this. But for those of you who are new and only listened to a couple of episodes, or this might be the only episode you've ever listened to us, apply the same sniff test to me and Ben. Are we a hard sell? Are we preaching quick gains? Are we preaching high-risk strategies? All that sort of stuff. That's for you to judge and for you to actually forensically go over us. But if we don't have transparency, if we're focused always on short-term gains, if we're treating ourselves like the hero, not the guide, well, then that's something that you should be wary of and be mindful of with us. Because here's what we do preach for those of you that want a summary. We preach, number one, we're flawed humans. We are the first to admit that, right? So there's no grandstanding from us. We're having a swing. We've got young families. We're creating lifestyle by design. We're building a business that we're trying to help others reach the flagship of 2,000 a week. So that's what we're doing. It's a get rich slow scheme. We are not involved in get rich quick, and anyone who isn't going to listen to our podcast anyway. We prioritize experiences over things. We reckon you should buy established property. It is very clear that we reckon you should avoid brand new property. If you don't know why, go and start at episode number 1. When it comes to shares versus property debate, we think it's irrelevant. They both have their place. You probably should have a bit of both. And we've also said that the quickest way to wealth is probably starting and growing your own business. But it's probably the hardest thing to pull off. Most small businesses don't make more than $1 million a year. Most small businesses don't make, that's $1 million in gross revenue, not profit. Most small businesses fail in the first 5 years. So if you are the type of person that can have a swing at that and win, great, have a swing. So whether shares versus property is a debate is irrelevant to us. We clearly think that leverage becomes the central umpire for us to dispute that discussion. Because the shares person will say shares is great, property will say property is great. We just go leverage is the answer. We rarely mention our business. In the first 150 eps, we had no idea. It started as a give back. Yes, we occasionally plug a webinar and a course, and we occasionally bring some of our expertise in, and we occasionally say that we're an investment savvy. Yes, we do say that. But generally speaking, it's not an advertisement for our business. And on that, we don't do any formal ads. To this day, people approach me, Ben, all the time, and they say, how do we get on? How can we are not going to do paid ads so that the podcast can make money through the paid ads. Some legitimate podcasts do. So no judgment there, but a lot of illegitimate podcasts do as well. So you're going to need to be able to try and decipher the difference. We only get the best people on our podcast, which we think are in the best interest of our community. But here we go. It's from our own biased filters. So we may or may not get that right. But the whole idea is we have a message that we're trying to curate for our audience, and we try and find the people who can come on and give expert advice that is not reckless in that regard. And here's the last one, Ben, before you make your closing comments. We want you to retire on $2,000 a week. But we think it'll take you 20 to 30 years to do it. But you're going to live those 20 to 30 years anyway. And if you do it, you'll be glad you did. So I guess that's my final word. Ben, what's your final word?
Well, I think it just comes back to our investment thesis and our ethos in terms of how we approach investing. And that is that when it's our money, we can potentially do whatever we want to do, right? But in terms of when we're playing with our clients' money, we're naturally conservative. We advocate for passive investing rather than active investing. So we don't do a lot of the value add stuff because we're not in the business of investing. It's something we do to the side so we can enjoy those experiences. And we base it on fundamental long-term returns. So we talk about margin of safety. We talk about, those types of things as part of, the productive use of what we're trying to do and where are we protecting our clients' money. Again, we don't always get it right. So it's important to understand that it's difficult when you are playing with other people's money in that particular space. But go back to the fundamental rules of what Warren Buffett talks about is like, rule number 1, don't lose money. And then rule number 2 is refer to rule number 1. So what we're trying to do is protect our clients' base. And does that mean we give away opportunities for quick cash and quick wins? Maybe that's true. But again, I much prefer to be in that position and steady, longer-term, get-rich-slow approach than trying to speculate where, 30 or 40% of the clients that we look after lose and the other 60% gain. Well, that's not the business we want to be in. And that's not the education that we want to pass on to our community.
We want a margin of safety, and the most recent example of what you just talked about is we actively chose not to chase the returns that were on offer in Tasmania.
Yep.
So short-term missed some of those, and we knew that. But then in hindsight, we look at now, some of those gains are coming off, and some of those stock levels and rental returns are coming off. So it plays into our long-term thesis, whereas if we were short-term investors, we would have been in that particular market, for example. So, Jen, thank you for your question.
Yeah.
Definitely a free course of start and build and the case studies and everything coming your way. But I think what I want to say, Ben, is Jen's asked a wonderful question that I think everyone can benefit from. It's clearly a question that's been on her mind. She tells us that she's in that Gen Z millennial age bracket. So clearly, and probably looking at some of these Finfluencers making claims, and it can get a bit agitating when you think, well, she's playing the long-term game, but seeing some of these quick riches that are on offer can be frustrating, I guess. So, Jen, thank you for that. And I just want to throw out to our TPC community that we're at the beginning of the show, we asked you for your input by telling us in our survey. But if you've got a framework that you want us to tackle, do what Jen did and reach out to us via SpeakPipe or via my Instagram. And I'd love to hear from you. And we'll tackle it like we did today. And hopefully we've done it justice. But the idea is to give you an idea of what it is, how they differ from traditional, some of the red flags, what does ASIC have to say about it, what's the next step for Jen moving forward, and then, of course, we had our final word there, Ben. So we covered a lot of ground. It's a lot longer than our typical episode, but I think it's probably worthwhile given that Finfluencing isn't going away in any shape or form in a hurry, Ben. So it's good for people to arm themselves and know what to look for.
Yeah, so by design, it is a long episode because it actually has a long shelf life. You could pick this episode up in 10 years' time in terms of what we're talking about, and the fundamentals won't change. Be careful, in terms of who you choose to operate with. Understand their quals, understand their experiences. All of those things will bode well in trying not to lose money.
100%. All right, my life hack today, Ben, it's very short. The other day I was on a plane, and you know how you get your iPhone and you've got your things, but it's what do? You hold and you don't have anything to put it on the chair in front of you. Well, I saw this other person do it, and I thought, oh, that's a great idea, because what I did is I actually had to change my seat. And so I went up to the service desk and they printed off, I don't know if you know they've got these, Ben, but they've got these old-fashioned plane tickets now that everyone has it on their phone, right? But back in the old days, it used to be just like an old-fashioned one. No one has that anymore.
A true physical boarding pass you're
Physical
referring to.
boarding pass, right? So I used the wrong terminology, plane ticket, a boarding pass, right? So what I did with the boarding pass, Ben, is you got to imagine this, right? So for the people listening, but pull down your tray in front of you. Sorry, fold the boarding pass in half, right?
Yeah.
Fold down the tray in front of you, put the first half in and then close it. So it's just flapping half left. And then you grab your phone and you pull out the cover and you slide the second bit on the back of the cover and then it just sits there.
Holds it up for you.
Holds it up for you. So now it's a limited life hack. I get it, right? Because A, no one has a paper boarding pass anymore, and B, if I'm advocating that you go up to the service desk and print out a boarding pass just so you can do this, I'm clearly not going green, am I? But it's just if you have one spare in your like it's in your suitcase or your laptop case or whatever that you've had previously, use it, folks. Bring it, keep it in your laptop case for when you're on a plane. Then you can sit there, and then it just hangs there. Ben, you put your AirPods in, and all of a sudden you're just sitting there watching your content, your Finfluencer content at your leisure. Exactly. What's making property news, mate?
Well, thank you for everyone who's hung around to the end, because we promised this at the start of the show, but we're taking a bit of a dive into the latest ABS data in terms of population movement. That's telling us a few things in terms of giving us some evidence in terms of what's actually happening from a natural increase, net interstate migration, and obviously net overseas migration as well. So you can see, if you're watching on YouTube, the first chart there, you can see nice and clearly in terms of net overseas migration. You're talking about New South Wales getting the bulk of those, Victoria getting the second lot, Queensland third, WA a significant amount of those, South Australia, and then obviously ACT, Tasmania and Northern Territory, not much at all. In terms of net interstate migration, you can see that New South Wales is in negative. You can also see that Tassie's in negative, what you were talking before about, Bryce, in terms COVID's gone now, people are moving back to the mainland, and also Northern Territory is also moving into negative territory. And the natural increase is the birth death rates. So you can see obviously in those bigger locations, you're also seeing that. So let's just talk quickly in terms of what we've seen, looking at the actual table charts. What do we see in terms of overall net impact in terms of what that looks like? So you can see that breakdown. You can see New South Wales from an overall point of view is negative 33,200 people. Victoria is negative 1,100 people. Queensland, one of the big winners, 32,000 people. South Australia is going negative at 1,000 people. And that per capita, that's significant compared to the 1,000 people in Victoria. WA also benefiting significantly with 11,000 people when you think about the size of their population over there. So that's a great news story for pent-up future demand for property. Tassie's, this is what I was saying before, 3,000 of a significantly small base. That's going to have a real impact in terms of Tassie. Northern Territory, negative 3,600. That's also a significant number when you're looking at that. And then ACT is negative 1,845. So the real big winners that we're seeing at the moment, Queensland and Western Australia. Now, in terms of, I wanted to then relate that into what I also talked about in terms of the latest property forecast, in terms of price forecast from our good friends at Oxford Economics. And they've got an interesting story here that over the next 3 years, that by June, so by the end of the financial year 2027, they're predicting that Sydney's median house price is going to be nudging almost $2 million at 1.93. Melbourne, wow. 1.23. So, and then you've got those changes. So in terms of percentage changes for houses, 18% over the next 3 years. Melbourne outperforming that because it's underperformed recently at 21%. Brisbane, a strong 19%. Adelaide, a strong 16%. Perth, an outstanding 30% growth story there. So they're buying into the whole story in terms of that. Canberra, positive 19. Hobart, only positive 13. So there's that lagging period. Darwin, also a smoky one of my smokies over the next couple of years as well. You saw 24% versus for houses. And then the unit story is also quite interesting. You're looking at unit prices in Sydney going to over $1 million, unit prices in Melbourne, 780,000, unit prices in Brisbane, very strong at 710,000. Adelaide, 690,000, Perth, 640,000, Canberra, very strong at 750,000, Hobart, 710,000. I've got a question mark on that one in terms of just income and economic activity in there. And Darwin, quite cheap with unit prices still sitting around that 460,000. But you're talking about 26% for Darwin, 16% for unit growth over the 3 years in percentage terms for Hobart, Canberra 20%, Perth 30%, 18% for Adelaide, 23% for Brisbane, 20% for Melbourne, and 22% for unit growth. So the economists and the forecasters at Oxford Economics are basically predicting that units will slightly outperform houses in that time. Now, in quick summary, what are they basing their logic on in terms of these projections? They're talking about a chronic undersupply, which we're definitely seeing playing out at the moment, and that's not going to go away anytime soon. And that's off the back also of lower interest rates, that strong population growth story in terms of the immigrants then starting to compete for stock. So they come here and rent first, but over the next 2 or 3 years, they're going to try and enter the property market. And then you've got the classic downsizers and cash buyers, and that intergenerational wealth transfer is starting to begin. So in terms of people saying, well, how can you justify? Remember, not everyone here is borrowing to buy those properties. 23% based on PEXA data are cash buyers. So, and then that intergenerational wealth transfer inheritance is going to start coming through. It bodes well for obviously very, very strong property prices over the next few years to come.
Very good. That's very insightful too. And I guess Sydney nudging 2 million. That will be a significant milestone that some people in the past, Ben, said that'll never happen. It's happened in the past. But as you can see, all but Hobart, Darwin and Adelaide will be over $1 million. And Adelaide and Hobart are pretty close. So anyway, good insights for people who wonder, have I left it too late, Ben? Is the property story over? Is it likely to continue to go up into the future? Well, hopefully that gives you some data to answer that question. Hey, we've covered some ground today. Again, thank you to Jen for sending through the question, folks. Did that resonate with you? If you've got any questions, reach out to us on socials. Send us a little note. We'd love to have a little follow-up to see if that helps you with the rise of the financial influencers. Until next week, Ben.
Knowledge is empowering, Bryce, but only if you act on it and don't be influenced by a Finfluencer.
Oh, well, the dark side of influencing anyway. See you next week, folks.